It's the night.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. Black Friday Game Day on Prime is an epic day of live sports. It all starts at 9 a.m. Eastern with the Capital One Skins game. Then, Black Friday football returns when the Bears take on the Eagles at 3 p.m. And it culminates with the final night of Emirates NBA Cup Group play with Bucks Knicks at 7 p.m. and Mavs Lakers at 10 p.m. Black Friday Game Day, only on Prime.
Ray-Ban Meta glasses come with open-ear audio, so you can listen to your favorite music without blocking out the world around you.
Hey Meta, play Gorgeous.
Here's Gorgeous by Doja Cat.
You can also ask Meta AI questions.
Hey Meta, when's Doja Cat's next concert?
Doja Cat is playing at the Los Angeles Theater next Tuesday.
Sweet.
Ray-Ban Meta glasses, available at Ray-Ban stores and other authorized retailers.
1970s. A new brand of international terrorists and revolutionaries are attacking the West. They're hijacking planes, holding hostages, and in their midst is one brave spy trying to prevent more terror. Welcome to the Spy Masters podcast. I'm your host, Antonia Senior. On this episode, I'm talking to Jason Burke about one story of many in his incredible new book, The Revolutionists. Jason is international security correspondent for The Guardian, and he's been a foreign correspondent for almost 30 years. He's written 4 critically acclaimed books. And stay with us for an eye-opening chat on his new one, where we talk terror, links between Marxism and Palestinian activism, and espionage. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcasts so we can keep bringing you all the best writers talking about spies. Jason, thank you so much for coming on the Spy Masters podcast.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, Jason, your book, huge in scope, and it covers the complete history of revolutionary violence, really, from the beginning of the 1970s right up until kind of mid-1980s. And we're going to concentrate on one fragment of it. But before we do that, I just want to ask you, obviously this was an enormous project and it's been 10 years in the making, I understand. Why this project? Why did you think it was important to do, even though obviously it was an extraordinary amount of work?
The idea of it came to me very clearly, as these things do, when I was working on my previous book in 2014-15 about ISIS and the latest wave of Islamist extremist violence that we had in Europe and UK and elsewhere. And I was looking at it and thinking, how can I approach this in a new way? I'd been commissioned to write a book by Penguin and couldn't quite see my way into it. I couldn't see a book in the way that I needed to. So I wrote what was basically a kind of potted history of Islamic militancy, thinking that that would do. And it didn't. It wasn't very good. So I dumped it and wrote something else. But it got me thinking along the historical sort of track, which is always how I approach problems anyway. And I thought, okay, so the we're looking at 2015, or we were then, the 20 teens. The OOs have been done. You know, we'd all written about them. I'd written my own large book about the OOs. The 90s, I'd also written about in my first book, and lots of others had. The 80s had been quite well investigated by people like Steve Cole in Ghost Wars, and Lawrence Wright had written a fair amount about the 80s. And so I ended up with the 70s. And when I started looking at the 70s, just thought, this is wild. And not only is it wild because of what was going on, but also I could suddenly see very clearly that at the beginning of the decade, you had a form of terrorism and an ideology and a type of organization that was so radically different, dramatically different from what you had at the end. So you start with these nationalists, broadly secular in the Middle East, very secular in the West, obviously, Marxist or leftist, left-leaning, progressive, in inverted commas, organizations, ideologies that were really in the vanguard and captured the energy and the moment of the late 60s and that kind of transformative historical instant. But at the end of the decade, that's completely changed in Western Europe into something very different, or it's just gone away. And in the Middle East, you have Islamism as the vanguard. And the type of violence has changed dramatically as well. So at the beginning of the decade, you have relatively benign. I mean, I'm not minimizing the horror for those who were victims. And certainly there were some very, very lethal, murderous incidents. But on the whole, it was, as a really good analyst said at the time, a lot of people watching and not a lot of people dead. That was the aim of the attackers. At the end, it's really the opposite. There's no great attention paid to sending an explicit message through violence, making statements, negotiating, making demands. It's just about the violence. And that violence is much, much more lethal and indiscriminate and involves quite often the deliberate death of the attacker. So you're much closer to something that we have today. And you're light years away from what we had at the beginning of the decade. And I just thought, how has this happened? And how is it related to the ideological shift from sort of left to right, from secular to faith? And so I started looking at it, and then I found the characters, and the characters were just extraordinary.
There are amazing characters throughout this book. We were just sort of talking before I pressed record, and you compared it to a kind of 19th century novel, and I think that's an incredibly excellent comparison that I hadn't really thought of, because it's so broad in its scope and in its characterization. I think for our purposes, we're going to talk primarily about one of those characters, who is a young Swede called Gunnar Ekberg, who kind of encapsulates, to a certain extent, a lot of the themes that you've articulated there. So we'll talk about how he gets into the whole business. But what's interesting from the perspective of the broader book, I think, is the fact that from the very beginning, he is being asked by his spy masters in Swedish intelligence to spy both on what they call the new left, this kind of new rising tide of radical leftist activism, which has kind of violent overtones, and Palestinian activism. Those are his two focuses, because they're already seen as completely linked when he gets into the game back in the late 60s, early 70s. So I think it's fascinating that's there, right there. Can you just, before we talk about Gunnar himself and how he gets involved, can you just talk to me about how it was that two seemingly disparate causes, Palestinian activism, Marxist-Leninism, became so intertwined in the beginning parts of this period that you're writing about?
That is a great question and a really important one. So you're absolutely right. By the late 60s, support for the Palestinian cause generally is an absolute prerequisite of being part of the new left. And when I was writing the book, I read a lot around the factual accounts and the sources. So I was reading novels from the time, watching films, all that sort of thing. And so two good examples of that, one directly relevant, the other less so, but the less relevant one is I watched again the Gino Pontecorvo film, The Battle of Algiers, which is a kind of classic depiction of resistance to colonialism. It's about the Algerian War of Independence, the Algerians rising up against the French colonial regime. And it was something that everybody on the left watched at that time. And it was also something that inspired the Palestinians. So the Algerian War and that film was seen as an example by the leading radicals of the Palestinians, who were committed to an armed struggle, as they called it at the time, as the exemplar. That's what they looked to. At the same time, a lot of the new left were watching it and seeing the Algerians and, by extension, the Viet Cong and the Cubans and the Angolans and pretty much anyone in what was then known as the Third World as part of the global opposition and resistance to capitalism and imperialism. So that was one element. The more direct element was when I read Norman Mailer, the great American novelist's book about demonstrations in around 67, 68, and he mentioned that you weren't a progressive unless you were pro-Palestinian. And these two elements are really connected. So being pro-Palestinian and therefore anti-Israeli at the time, by the late 60s, was seen as just something that were absolutely linked. And that's quite interesting because 10 years earlier, Israel had been seen as a kind of bastion of democracy and socialism, even in the Middle East, surrounded by reactionary dictatorships. And that changed with the 67 war and several other factors. But certainly by the late 60s, all these causes fused into one thing, whether it was, as I say, the successful battles for independence by people like the Algerians or the Cubans, Che Guevara obviously being the kind of poster boy of the whole movement, literally and figuratively. And the Palestinians were very much seen as part of that global movement and therefore an essential part of the networks around the world that the leftists in US, in UK, in Europe, and in Sweden, where Gunnar Ekberg was, had to support.
I found it really interesting, and I was fascinated as well by the kind of, cultural tensions between the two movements as well. You have a wonderful passage where you talk about the training of radical leftists in Fatah kind of training camps, and how some of the left-wing socialists wanted to drink beer and have sex while they were training, and Bardo wouldn't take off his tight velvet trousers. I love that detail.
No, so yeah. I also heard it from the other side. So it's one of my favourite moments on the British Maoists who get drunk and start fighting everybody. Yeah. So this is when the Palestinians were obviously engaged in guerrilla war, insurgent war. They saw it as an armed struggle. The Israelis called them terrorists. After 1967 and the Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, and to continue this armed struggle, they had, as they call it, they had camps, training camps set up initially in Jordan, later in Lebanon, and a lot of the more committed, more adventurous of the new left activists in Europe went over, not really to get training, but just to kind of get a taste of it and really burnish their left-wing credentials. And some were already very committed to the Palestinian cause. Others, in the words of one of the former commanders of these camps, were relatively recent supporters, in inverted commas, and knew absolutely nothing about it. That's what he told me in Ramallah in the West Bank a couple of years ago. And they turned up, and they were coming out of the radical left 1960s and university campuses and so forth in Europe, or squats and communes and so on. And so the idea that they were going to have segregated accommodation and the girls were going to sleep one side and the boys were going to sleep the other was just out. They all wanted to sleep together, and they were all in their kind of kaftans or their velvet trousers or whatever, and they wanted to drink. And Fatah, that you just referred to, Yasser Arafat's organization, was quite a conservative organization. It was represented quite folksy, grassroots Palestinian culture, and it's in the middle of the Middle East, and the kind of the very progressive lifestyles of Westerners just did not fit in at all, and it caused a lot of tension. I mean, Layla Khaled, who was the icon of the left, a young, very striking, very articulate hijacker for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And I did get very Monty Python when I was writing this book with all the names and so forth. But so she was PFLP, who were a rival to Fatah, and much more left wing actually. And even I was talking to her, and she said they came over, these leftists from Europe, and they weren't serious. They thought that just having a university sit-in was the revolution. Well, it isn't. The revolution is much more serious and demanding than just sort of, squatting your university canteen. And then they were just obsessed with these what she called it, they're obsessed with these girl-boy things. They want to talk about these sexual matters. I mean, what's that got to do with the revolution? And her attitude was basically, that's not, that's not proper. You get on, that's not right. They shouldn't be discussing that. You should be fighting the revolution. And all this stuff was just a distraction and moderately distasteful. So yeah, the cultural gaps. They shared the same sort of language. They were all talking about capitalism, imperialism, fighting that, and fighting Zionism, now seen as a extension of the other enemies. But when it actually came to sort of real cultural or ideological affinity, it was much, much rarer.
There are so many rabbit holes we could go down about modern parallel links, but we'll park those to one side for a minute. Let's talk about Gunnar Ekberg. So he had quite an interesting sort of family, which gave him his potential moral impetus. Tell me a little bit about him, where he was from, who they were, and why that then fed into his later career in intelligence.
Yeah, well, I mean, just as one of those rabbit holes, one of the interesting things I found was how often the people I was talking to, who had been very young when they did what I write about in the book, had come from families where it was clear the parents and the context had a really strong ideological influence. So Leila Khaled, who I just referred to, came from an activist, left-wing, socialist, Arab nationalist family. Her brothers were part of the movement. Her dad was very supportive and so forth. Gunnar, who's a spy, not a revolutionist, also came from a background that was clearly contributing to his ideological worldview and therefore his willingness to spy for the Swedish secret services. He was born in 1945 at the end of the Second World War into a family which had very strong ideas of what was right and what was wrong, or as he put it, democracy and its opposite. An uncle had been married to a Jewish woman in Germany during the Second World War. Married before the Second World War and had to flee during the Second World War, came back to Sweden where the rest of the family were from. His parents, one had been a nurse during the war. His father had been conscripted, like so many other Swedes. And they had very clear ideas about that conflict and how it was a battle of light versus dark and good versus evil and right versus wrong. And he said he never doubted that the Cold War was an extension of that, a battle for freedom and democracy and so forth. He's not super right wing, just a strong sense that Soviet style authoritarianism wasn't the right thing for Europe and was intrinsically wrong, which was very different from a lot of other young people in Sweden and in Western Europe at the time. And he, like so many others, I think, kind of stumbled into espionage. And that when he was a very keen diver, he grew up in Malmo on the Swedish coast and dived a lot, swam a lot. And he went out with a friend when he was about 19 and went down to a sunk Soviet signaling vessel that had recently gone down. And he stripped it of some interesting items just for fun with his mate. And this eventually got back kind of via the Coast Guards probably and others to Swedish authorities and to the Swedish security services, who came to see him and said, well, actually, we're quite interested in what you picked up. And could you go back down and have another look and see what else you can get? Which he then did. So I think for the secret services then, who were actually a rather weird outfit called the Intelligence Bureau that we can talk about in a moment. He was obviously a capable young man with the right attitudes and willingness to take some risk. And they thought this, could be very useful to us. And so he did his military service and university and so forth, and they stayed in touch. And after his military service, they approached him again and said, would you want to do some missions for us, basically? And he said yes. And the first mission he got well, the first thing they asked him to do, I don't think it was as formal as a kind of mission as such, was to infiltrate leftist groups in Malmo and in Stockholm, where he was living, communist or Marxist-Leninist groups in Sweden, which they felt were a threat, both in terms of what the groups might do or radicals within those groups might do, but also because they might be infiltrated by the KGB. And
Right.
so that was seen as a potential risk, which they wanted to counter by having their own guy in those groups.
So for someone who's sort of kind of young and idealistic, but sort of anti-Stalin autocracy, Stalinist autocracy, I should say. I mean, did he have any sort of reservations about working for an agency like the Swedish one, which, as you say, is sort of a bit odd and shadowy? It's kind of not formally recognised.
No, it wasn't. It was the Intelligence Bureau, which was set up under the Ministry of Defence without any real proper oversight or clearance. Only a few officials and maybe even only a few parliamentarians knew anything about it. There was another, existing Swedish police force which had its own intelligence services and so forth, sort of equivalent of UK special branch, and this was all and equivalent to other sort of more traditional services, which this was not part of and actually a rival to. But no, I don't think he did. I mean, I think he saw it all as a big adventure. He was fighting the right fight, the good fight, and was happy to help out. He also got to do lots of diving, which he loved.
Yeah, the diving's really interesting. So that was one of the ways he burnished his credentials everywhere he went, that he was like an extreme diver.
He's pretty he's just military trained, because when they sent him the spooks arranged for him to do his military service as a military diver. So he does have some pretty rare skills in terms of capabilities of being able to swim about in, well, up there, very cold water, keep himself alive, and plant mines or whatever on attack shipping or infiltrate or do whatever you want to do, but underwater around the Baltic. And even now, it's a pretty rare skill. I think in the early 70s, it was, or late 60s, it was mid to late 60s. It was really, really, scarce for anybody to have those kind of capabilities. So he was a real asset. But obviously, when it became known that he'd had these kind of skills, the other side were very interested as well. So, I mean, the leftists he starts off infiltrating were not committed to violence in any way. I mean, they quite like the idea of the armed struggle against repressive regimes, but who didn't in the late 60s?
Yeah, as long as someone else was doing it, though.
Largely, yeah. And so very few of them had actually done their military service because they got out of it by being, students and other things. And a lot of in Germany, it was the same, actually. I found during my research that a lot of the real radicals, had got out of going into the army, and the army or whichever military wing was very happy to not have them because they just would have been disruptive. But so Gunnar had done his military service. Not only that, he'd done it as a military diver. So this was an in. It was a way. He'd also read by homework a load of kind of incredibly tedious Marxist theory, and so could get involved in these totally esoteric debates over the Marxist dialectics or whatever it was, Hegelian, this, that, and the other, and the combination he's quite a nice bloke as well. He's very charming. He was a good-looking young man and very plausible. And the package was a useful one to get it to make his entry to these groups and get himself trusted.
I can imagine as well that if you're a kind of radical hippie-ish lefty in the beginning of the 1970s and someone's done military service, you'd probably be a bit wary of them. But if they'd done military diving and you had that diver coolness, and and he's good looking, as you say, and probably charming, I can imagine that going down brilliantly. But his initial reports are kind of, there's not much going on, and they're just seen as kind of long rambles about the kind of as you say, the sort of, the word jumble of Marxist factionalism.
So to check it, just on that, just to check what he told me, because I spent hours talking to him, and I needed to somehow verify it. So one of the things I did was find and translate some Swedish government inquiries into espionage activities at the time. These are obviously quite recent inquiries when all of this came out. And I just ran them through sort of DeepL or Google Translate. And you can see all these references to his spying activities and how actually what he was producing was very detailed, but not really much use. He really became much more useful when he got sent overseas.
Yeah, so that happens, and he's invited to basically go to Egypt and Jordan to kind of meet some of the linked groups that are fighting kind of Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism. He goes out there. Tell us about his first couple of trips out to the Middle East. Who does he meet and what does he find there?
So in '68, I think he is now quite a well-known member of the more radical groups in Stockholm, and is known for his sort of interest in foreign affairs and a sort of international outlook, an internationalist outlook, which was very much part of the movement at the time. And so when another trip is being put together, because they do quite a lot of these, to the Middle East, to learn about the, in inverted commas, air quotes, struggle against Zionism, capitalism, imperialism, etc., he's asked if he wants to go. So he speaks to his handlers who say, yeah, absolutely. That's a brilliant opportunity to find out about not just the broad context in Cairo or in Amman, Jordan's capital, or elsewhere, Beirut, but you might actually get close to the armed factions among the Palestinians themselves. Now, this is a time when those armed factions, at least a couple of them, are beginning to attack in Europe and hijack planes, and there's shootouts and there's grenades thrown into Israeli airlines offices and quite a lot of other incidents. A plane is brought down over Switzerland and dozens killed by a bomb in a parcel, and these sorts of things are building, and the Swedish secret services know absolutely nothing about it, and so they're very worried that something will happen in Sweden, or if it won't happen in Sweden, which is pretty progressive in its foreign policy, then Sweden might get used as a base to launch them elsewhere. And they, like most Western European services at the time, are really very ignorant of who's among the group's leaders, what the groups want, their capabilities, how they work, everything basically. So when Gunnar gets invited on this trip, they tend to go and give him a bit of a briefing. And to be honest, it's unbelievably sketchy. I mean, they just send him off with a tiny bit of tradecraft to sort of try and keep him out of trouble. Like, don't ask stupid questions or obvious questions about bombs going off in Europe, when you're going to do it next and this sort of thing. But it's perfectly clear that he's completely on his own. I mean, if something goes wrong, then, he is in a very great deal of trouble. And there are shorter ways to say that. They involve one word in terms of how he would end up. And he goes anyway because he's really interested and excited by it. And the first trip takes him to Cairo and Amman. And he goes into some of the camps, and they do kind of the same thing that the other activists have done. They do a little trip round refugee camps where the Palestinians are, following expulsion, displacement from flight from what has become Israel. They meet civil society and do cultural stuff, but they also, if they want to, a couple of days in one of the training camps. And so Gunnar gets 2 days in actually a Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine camp, which is one of the most left-wing factions. And that camp is near Amman in Jordan. And he spends a couple of days there. And he meets a lot of the senior people, or the mid-ranking people, really. And then he comes home. But he's impressed them. not least because of his military diver credentials that they're very interested in. And he's spoken to them about what he can do and how you do that and so on, how you put explosives on ships in harbours, all these sorts of things. And they say to him, well, come back and see us and we'll try and introduce you to a few more senior people, including some of the individuals that really interest his handlers.
So he meets a guy who's kind of instrumental in lots of ways. Excuse me if I get the names wrong. Wadi Haddad.
That's perfect. Yeah.
There you go. And he's like a key strategist for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And he's had an insight which has kind of changed lots of things in how this is all playing out on the world stage, because he basically realizes that they don't have to fight the war for Palestinian liberation in Palestine. They could fight it anywhere. It's a non-geographic struggle there are no terrestrial limits, right? So he's had this kind of realization, and this is where the Palestinian fighters, however you want to term them, go off beyond the limits of Palestine and Israel and into Europe and into the plains, as you mentioned. So this is a whole new phase that Gunnar suddenly finds himself caught up in.
Yeah, and so Wadi Haddad is one of the founders of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, but he has this strategy that he evolves in the late 60s, which is that he calls it from the forest to the skies, the forest being the absolutely stereotypical environment of the guerrilla as they see themselves. So that's, think about Cuba and Che Guevara and the Viet Cong fighting the Americans. They're all fighting in the jungles and the forests and all of this. So the guerrilla sticks in the forest. And then there's been a lot of talk about the urban forest for the urban guerrillas, with these kind of cities being the same as a forest where the guerrillas can hide in the urban environment and strike against the oppressors and the regimes in whatever country they're in. And Haddad sees that there's this whole space that's opened up, which is new, very new, basically created by modern aviation at the time, which has suddenly expanded massively. So you have all these new airports and all these flights, and it's still expensive, but it's a totally new thing that is appealing to millions across the developed world that never there before. And there's almost no security precautions taken by the airlines or by the airports, by pretty much anyone. And it's hugely vulnerable. And it also is spectacular. So Haddad sees that if he can hijack a plane of a third country, crucially, it doesn't have to be an Israeli plane, it could be an American plane, then the attention that the Palestinians' grievances will get is going to be immense globally. And that's what he's aiming for. And he has this particular understanding at a particular moment. And that moment is just when Gunnar is dispatched to the Middle East and eventually meets Haddad, which is one of his key aims, tasks, as given to him by his handlers. And he meets Haddad in Beirut. They have a convivial conversation. And this is someone who certainly no Western spy has any got close to. I mean, we can talk about how all these groups were infiltrated at the time, because they were penetrated from top to bottom, often by each other actually, but by Israelis, by the Jordanians, not by the Western services very much. And that's what made Gunnar's access so valuable. And he spends time with Haddad, who gives him some tasks to do in Sweden when he goes back to Sweden, like getting some passports, Swedish passports, which are going to be really useful for them. They really need Western passports. So asks him to do that. He asks him to track down a former supporter who they suspect of being a double agent and just check his address and do that kind of reconnaissance thing. And they're going to kill him, this other activist, the suspected traitor. And there's this moment where Gunnar thinks they're going to ask him to actually murder this Swedish activist or Palestinian activist living in Sweden. And it turns out that isn't the case, which is a huge relief. And then and they send him off, and he goes back to Sweden. And they send him off again with the he's a good spy. He's very plausible, and they send him off with the message, go and do all idle, fairly mundane tasks for us, partly aimed at establishing his credibility, and then come back and see us again. Bring us the passports, and then we'll talk about something else.
Yeah, so he manages to sort of get in with them, and he does a fantastic job of providing.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans. Even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes. Now available in... Ooh, crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox. Clean feels good.
The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in more places that could expose you more to identity theft. But LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, our US-based restoration specialists will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Don't face drained accounts, fraudulent loans, or financial losses alone. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Some kind of general intelligence. He doesn't get any specific intelligence that preempts in this period any actual specific attacks, which you say he feels, that doesn't make him happy. He would like to have been able to, preempt things, and he doesn't in this period. And there's a couple of really big moments in the story that happen while he's kind of sniffing around and making friends. So one of them is, we've already slightly referred to, is the hijackings with Layla Khaled. And the second then happens, which is a massive, massive deal, happens at the Munich Olympics. So just give us a very potted account of the Munich Olympics.
Sure. So 1972 Munich Olympics is, as you say, absolutely massive. I mean, it's one of the most memorable events of that period, certainly one of the most striking. And it is an attack by Black September is the name of the organization, which is actually a Fatah organization. So that's Yasser Arafat's outfit, which is given the name Black September to disguise its connection to him, basically, for plausible deniability reasons, diplomatic and political or other reasons. And the attack involves a team of Palestinians from Fatah sent into the Olympic Village in Munich, West Germany, to take captive as many Israeli athletes and coaches as they can during the games. And one of the reasons this becomes such a massive deal is not just that it is the Olympics and there's a supposed sporting truce where none of this has happened, none of this is meant to happen, and it is unprecedented in terms of a national team being targeted and taken captive in the way that actually transpired, but also because it's really heavily televised, obviously. And this is the beginnings of live broadcast. Remember, we just got the satellite technology in that allows live broadcast. People have got TVs in their living rooms for the first time. It's like 9 out of 10 American and 4 out of 5 British homes have a telly now, which I wouldn't have had 10 years earlier. And that makes a huge difference. Anyway, there's a theorist 10 years earlier, an Algerian, at the beginning of the late 50s actually, who says it's much better, this is when the Algerians are fighting the French, it's much better to attack a Frenchman in Paris, a single Frenchman, than to die in a ditch killing dozens in Algeria. I'm paraphrasing, but the point being that if it's in front of people and it's being televised, it's the attention that matters. And at the Olympics, they can get massive attention. So this team of attackers take 11 hostage in Israeli athletes and coaches hostage in Munich. They kill 2 in the first moments of the attack. And to cut a long story short, the Germans decide they're going to try and free the hostages, botch it terribly, and they're all killed, along with all but 3 of the attackers. It's horrific. It's a complete debacle from the German perspective, but it is a massively important moment in the 70s. And Gunnar had no idea that this was going to happen. He's got a couple of inklings. He's seen a few bits and pieces and heard the scraps of conversation and the odd document that he's caught sight of that indicates something might be coming or other attacks might be coming, but he's never got the whole picture, as you'd expect. But he still feels guilty. And he told me how he sat with his girlfriend, fiance, watching the TV coverage of the attack on the Olympics and just felt sick, didn't sleep all night because he felt he'd missed something that could have saved a lot of lives.
He's that summer. Actually, before I just want to mention to my listeners that, you know, this is one of a number of set pieces in your book that is just told so brilliantly. It was just breathtaking, your account of everything that happens in Munich. So another reason to run out and buy the book. But one of the things that happens that summer is that Gunnar is basically given to the Mossad by the Swedish. So, you know, talk us through what happened there.
So the Swedes, I think, are aware that they can't protect Gunnar in any substantial way if he gets into difficulties in the Middle East. They're also keen to build up their relationship with the Israelis because the Israelis have lots of really useful intelligence. And in the summer of 72, the Swedes ask Gunnar if he will spy for the Mossad. And he says yes. He's introduced to a man called Danny. They meet in Copenhagen in the Mövenpick Hotel, I think, actually, amid all the amazing 60s and 70s decor of kind of egg-shaped chairs and, you know, plastic tables and all this stuff, orange carpets. And he gets briefed, and there's a lovely moment that he told me about when Danny says, "Are you frightened?" Gunnar says, "Yeah, I am, actually." And Danny says, "Good, because a good spy is frightened. You
I love that bit.
You need to stay alert. You know, what you're doing is dangerous." And they also brief him on quite a lot of tradecraft, much more than he's had from the Swedes. And they fly him to Israel by a really weird circuitous route that involves him going to Vienna and then going out of the airport formally, so getting stamped into Austria, and then going back into the airport through a back entrance, basically, and then flying on to Tel Aviv, therefore with a passport that is stamped in Austria, and then back to Austria, back out through a back entrance, and then back exit, and then back in again through the front exit, getting the stamp to allow him now to fly back to Sweden with his passport that looks like he's just spent 10 days in Austria, whereas actually he's been in Israel, and where they teach him a lot, talk to him about disguises and using secret codes and how to contact his various handlers and so forth, and set him up with diving sessions with Israeli Special Forces divers and all this sort of thing. And then he is sent off on his next mission, which is to go back and get as close as he can to Wadi Haddad, back to Beirut.
And in this period, he helps, doesn't he, feed information to the Mossad, which contributes to Operation Wrath of God. Can you just tell us?
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, this is a fascinating little detail. And this is when you're writing a big book. It's these kind of little details early on that you suddenly realize much later are really important, even if at the time there didn't seem to be. So Gunnar talks about how Haddad liked sweets, and in his meetings they'd sit there drinking very sweet tea or coffee, and there'd always be this box of chocolates or plate of pralines, particularly actually, or baklava or something. Had a very sweet tooth. Haddad did, and he tells this to the Mossad guys because they debrief him really thoroughly about Haddad. Everything, absolutely everything. His routines, his family, his views on everything, anything, it's exhaustive. Much more thorough than the Swedes have been. And one of the things he tells them is that Haddad has this sweet tooth. Now, 1977, Haddad dies or is killed. And he dies of a mystery illness that causes him appalling stomach pains and there's lots of other symptoms and internal bleeding. And it's very protracted and very unpleasant. And there is a lot of evidence that he was killed by the Mossad, with quite possibly, and this is what senior former Mossad people say, although others also deny it, but that they got a box of chocolates laced with toxins to him, or possibly more than one, but at least one of Belgian chocolates bought in London, actually. And they were laced with something that would cause those symptoms. And eventually, cumulatively, as he keeps eating these chocolates unaware, killing him. An alternative is that it was toothpaste. They got toxins into the toothpaste. But one way or another. Now that's plausible. He dies in an East German clinic, courtesy of the Stasi, Haddad. And there are reports from the doctors saying it looks very much like he's poisoned. As I say, former Mossad people say, yeah, we did it. And then others said to me, terrorists get cancer too, because that was the other possibility. There's some kind of blood cancer. It's never identified as a disease or the cause of death, never really understood, just the symptoms. And either are possible. But it's also possible that the idea of doing this came from Gunnar and his detail about the sweet tooth of Haddad. That said, the Mossad did have other sources around Haddad through the period.
Sure. But I mean, that fits because in that period, in the aftermath of Munich, the Israelis for the first time fight the war beyond the territory as well. So they go out in Operation What of God and start assassinating on foreign soil the people that they believe are responsible. But Gunnar then does have a coup. Tell us about the Sunion and what happened around that particular instance.
Yeah, so this is the effort by Haddad to sink a cruise ship / ferry in the Mediterranean. And it involves a ship called the Sunion, which is full of a lot of American tourists going to Israel, among whom inevitably there'll be a high proportion of Jewish people. And Haddad knows it's going to dock at Beirut and then travel down to Haifa. And he thinks there's an opportunity here to put some kind of magnetic mine on the hull of the ship and sink it. And he calculates that the passengers will probably be able to get into their lifeboats and there won't be great loss of life. He's not trying to sink the thing like the Titanic out in the Mediterranean, but it will be absolutely spectacular and very much part of, as you nicely put it, the move into this new international sphere that hasn't previously been exploited by these armed Palestinian factions. And had calls on the services of the guy he knows, the only guy he knows who is a really well-trained military diver who could do this stuff. And Gunnar meets him in Beirut, and Haddad explains that he wants Gunnar to be involved. And again, for a moment, Gunnar has this appalling realization that he's going to be involved and might actually have to plant the explosives himself on this ship. This turns out to be not the case, and all his job is going to be is to train the divers that Haddad has got, 2 Palestinians who've done a bit of scuba, and they're going to do it. And so he does that. He trains them and he designs the route into the ship, how they can do it once the ship docks and all the rest of it. And they discuss the operation. And so he has absolutely every detail of what the attack is going to involve, how it's going to go down. And so this is the first time he has actually got live information about a forthcoming attack that could endanger the lives of hundreds of people. And it's pretty terrifying. So he goes back to his hotel and he writes a letter to his wife then now, which is full of all these code words. So the letter looks like it's a long and quite tedious discussion about diving equipment and which is the best diving equipment in Sweden that he wants to get hold of when he gets home. But it's actually full of these code words that tell his wife to alert Danny, the Mossad handler, that something is up. Not much more than that. He can't say much more than that with these code words, but there's something going down. However, he can use basically invisible ink to write, and literally between the lines of another letter that he posts to an address he's been given in Beirut, where he delivers it. Some of the stuff that, I mean, Gunnar was very forthcoming, but on some details he wasn't so forthcoming. And I found that with quite a lot of my interviewees for this, in that I was talking to them about things that happened 60 years ago. And particularly among those who were committing the attacks, the attackers or people around them, they were still observing kind of operational security. So I knew they were lying to me because I've seen, the Secret Service investigations after events, and I've interviewed other people, and I've got hold of loads of documents and classified stuff and stuff that's been declassified. And I know when they're, fibbing basically. They still say, no, we found the explosives. I just went back to my hotel room and somebody had delivered them to my hotel room. That's absolute rubbish. I knew they'd gone, their courier had brought them. I knew who their courier was, but they're still sort of maintaining the operational security. And Gunnar didn't go into great details on this, but basically he gets a message through to the Mossad saying that this attack on this ship, the Sunian, is about to happen. And then he has to wait. And there's this amazing moment where he desperately wants to leave Beirut, obviously. He doesn't want to be there when it happens. And particularly doesn't want to be there when it happens, if the Mossad is successful and they somehow abort it. And he doesn't know how they're going to do that. But when it does happen, he's going to have some questions to answer, obviously, if it goes wrong. And so he absolutely wants to run. But then to do so would be super suspicious. So he doesn't. He sits there kind of frozen for a few days, really scared, until Haddad says, listen, you might as well go because just hanging around isn't going to help. It's just another thing to handle or whatever. It may be suspicious. So just go. And he's incredibly relieved. And he does. He leaves. And the attack does occur, but weirdly, the mines, the explosives, bombs, which have been placed by Gunnar's divers that he trained on the hull of the ship, go off early. So it just settles in port where it's shallow, and the passengers can literally just walk off. So it's unpleasant. There's a big hole blown in the hull, which would have sunk it, but it does sink, but only like 6 feet onto the bed of the harbour, port in Beirut. And so no harm done, nobody's hurt, no casualties. And Haddad has to organise this investigation into what went wrong and whether it was the fuses or the mines or whatever. And doesn't suspect Gunnar at all. So it's a very clever way of aborting the operation or preventing the attack.
Because your assumption is that Mossad wanted to protect Gunnar because he was a really good source. So your assumption is that they found a way to...
Yeah. Well, there's that they would want to protect him because he's a great source. And also they just wouldn't want to disclose in any general way that they had a warning of some sort. So the two, and Gunnar's actually flown back to Tel Aviv, and he's in Tel Aviv when the attack goes down, and he's with the Mossad when they get the news of what's happened, and they open a bottle of champagne, and he collapses on a sofa in nervous exhaustion and just can't cope with it.
There's a scene in which you have him and his wife sitting in a bar, and it's cold and it's raining and it's very atmospheric.
Jaffa.
She says something to me that I think is going to resonate with me for a long time, thinking about everything that you've written about in this book. And she just says to him, "How does this end?"
Yeah, how does this end? She says, and he says, "I don't know, but I can't end it now. I can't leave it now." And by this stage, he's been doing this for several years, and he said to me that he had this gnawing fear in the pit of his stomach all the time because he's living on borrowed luck. And actually, he is. I mean, spoiler alert, what happens is absolutely demonstrates that he is living on borrowed time. And, within a year, he's no longer a spy.
Right.
And only just gets away with it.
And is alive and giving you fabulous interviews to stock your book with wonderful stories.
Yeah, because what happens is he goes back after the Sunnian, he goes back to Sweden. And I could just say you're going to have to buy the book to find out, but I'll tell you anyway. I'll tell you anyway. So he goes, because it's brilliant. He goes back to Sweden, and he's still involved with the New Left and these kind of radical groups. And somehow he is betrayed, or somebody in one of these groups learns of what he's been doing and tips off not the PFLP, which is Haddad's bunch, but the DFLP, which is a rival group that this individual, I think, is closer to, sends all this information in a letter unmasking Gunnar. And Gunnar is actually there in Beirut when it turns up, and it goes to the DFLP office, not the PFLP office. And the DFLP, we don't know what happens, but basically they don't tell the PFLP. Maybe the envelope just sat there unopened. Maybe they didn't know about it. Maybe they lost it. Maybe they didn't lose it, because they eventually they do tell the PFLP, and Gunnar is finished. Actually, no, we don't know what happened. Sorry, it's so complicated. I can't even remember my own book. But it sits there unanswered, we think. But anyway, he doesn't get any. It has arrived before he leaves. So he's there in Beirut with the PFLP while this letter unmasking him is with the DFLP. I told you it was all very Monty Python. and they don't communicate the contents of this letter for whatever reason. Gunnar then goes back to Sweden and just about, it is safe. And then he is unmasked by the media. Well, the media unmasked the whole of the intelligence bureau and this kind of weird spook outfit that isn't really legal, certainly doesn't have proper oversight, and it all collapses. And in that, he's kind of outed, and his spying days are over. But it's very close, because if the letter had been read and the information given to the right people, he would have been tortured and shot.
He's incredibly brave. And as you say, you've interviewed him lots of times. He's now living in Sweden quite happily.
Yeah, he had a career
by all this.
He's great, Gunnar. He's a really brilliant memory, for one thing, and he's got lots of source material to back it up, pictures and documents and things. But he had a very successful career as an advertising executive. He's really interested still in history and Cold War and so forth. He still researches. He still does a lot of diving. And when I talked to him about taking those kind of risks in his early to mid 20s, he's proud of it. I mean, he doesn't see it as being particularly brave. He just says, I was really committed to the cause and so forth. I felt it was the right thing to do. But I think also he really enjoyed the adventure, and he enjoyed the travel and being in the Middle East, being involved in something big and important. And he was good at it, which I think brought its own rewards. But he doesn't talk about it in terms of being in terms of courage. It's much more about that he felt it was an important thing to be engaged on at the time.
Jason, just to bring us to a close, this has been absolutely fascinating. And as I've said multiple times, there's so much more in your book to explore. To jump forward in an incredibly unsatisfactory way, because otherwise I'll be keeping you here all day. By the mid-1980s, basically, your argument is that the threat from far-left violence, particularly in Europe, has completely receded. But in the Middle East, violence is flourishing, and acts which some people define as terrorism and other people define as resistance are flourishing. To what do you attribute that kind of divergence of
That's really good question. It's one I try to answer in the book. I started in one moment in the late 60s for a good reason, and that's because that's when you see very similar activism in Europe and in the Middle East. Now, in Europe, by the late 70s, it's sort of disappeared. I mean, you've had the Baader-Meinhof gang, so-called, in Germany. They're pretty much gone. You've had various other people around Western developed countries, Japanese Red Army, Weather Underground in the US, sundry others. But really that kind of far left violent activism is over. And you've got far right activism, violent activism, but you've also got a lot of environmentalism and identity politics. And the ideology has broken down, faded. It's much more fragmented. It's much more about individual causes against nuclear power, against nuclear weapons, against pornography, all those mobilizing factors that informed politics, radical politics in the Middle East is very different. The left in the Middle East has not had any success as it has in the West, where a lot of reforms have been enacted, giving women rights to abortion and better universities for young people and lower voting ages, lots of things that the people in the 60s were shouting for. There have been no reforms whatsoever in the Middle East. There's been no progress towards a resolution of the Palestinian grievances. Most of the leaders who are in power, certainly many of them at the beginning of the decade, are still there towards its end. There is more violence than ever and more inequality than ever, all of which drive radical activism. And because the left has been completely destroyed, and leaders killed or exiled and its supporters eradicated or scattered, you end up with a vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum, and so does radicalism. And so by the end of the 70s, you have a new ideology or a resurgent ideology with different vocabulary and different framing, but many of the same aims. Certainly it's much more socially conservative, but the enemies remain oppressors, the imperialists, the capitalists, the Zionists. And that ideology is radical Islam, and it proposes a utopian solution through violence in the same way that radical leftism did 10 or 15 years ago, but it adds an identity component, and that's a really powerful combination. So that's my answer to the question that I posed at the beginning when I was talking about why you start with something that is so different from the terrorism that you have at the end. And it's really because the left failed or was prevented from succeeding, and nothing much else has changed. So as ever, some people will seek a solution to their problems through violence and through a different set of ideas, an alternative set of ideas and methods.
Jason, thank you so much. That's lots to think about, especially given the current world in which we're grappling with some of these same issues still, astonishingly. So thank you so much for coming on the Spy Masters podcast and sharing that all with us.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow, tweet, spread the word, so that we can keep bringing you more brilliant writers talking about spies. Don't miss an episode of the Spy Masters podcast.